Margaret Collins slammed her grandmother's iron pot onto the cracked, dust-covered stove inside the most forgotten building in Red Willow, Montana. A kitchen so ruined that even the rats had given up on it, and she made herself a single, unbreakable promise out loud to no one but the four broken walls around her. "I will not leave this town the way they expect me to." She was 38 years old. She was a widow. She was a plus-size woman with calloused hands and a grief-hollowed heart, and every single soul in Red Willow had already decided she would fail. They had no idea what was coming. If you have ever been handed something broken and turned it into something beautiful, stay right here with me, because this story belongs to you. Subscribe to this channel, follow along until the very last word, and drop a comment below, telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far Maggie Collins's story is going to travel. Now let's begin. The iron pot hit the stovetop so hard, the sound rang out across the empty kitchen like a gunshot. Margaret Collins did not care who heard it. She stood in the middle of the most abandoned, most forgotten, most pitiful structure in all of Red Willow, Montana territory, in the summer of 1887, and she looked at every broken, rotting, humiliating inch of it, and she did not cry. She had already used up her tears on the trail west. She had cried over her husband's grave back in Kansas. She had cried the night the bank took the house. She had cried until there was nothing left inside her chest, but something harder and quieter, and altogether more dangerous than grief. She called it purpose. And right now, that purpose was staring at a collapsed shelf on the far wall, a stove with a door that hung by one hinge, two tables that had been rotting so long they had begun returning themselves to the earth, and a ceiling that let three separate patches of Montana sky shine directly through its wounds. "Well," Maggie said aloud, because there was no one else to say anything to, "it ain't pretty." She pulled her sleeves to her elbows. "But neither was I when I started." She had arrived in Red Willow 3 days earlier on the back of a supply wagon driven by a taciturn man named Holt, who had not spoken more than 14 words to her the entire 2-day journey from Billings. She had not minded. She had spent the ride watching the land open up around her, the great flat amber sweep of the Montana territory. The sky so enormous, it felt like a second earth turned upside down above her head, and she had felt for the first time since she buried Thomas something that might eventually become peace. The town had not offered peace. The town had offered stairs. She was a large woman. She had been a large woman her entire life, and she had long since made a kind of stubborn truce with the fact that the world would always notice her size before it noticed anything else about her. In Red Willow, that truth arrived with particular sharpness. She had climbed down from Holt's wagon with her one wooden trunk and her iron pot tucked under her arm, and she had felt the attention of the entire main street settle on her like a brand. 2 men standing outside the feed store stopped talking. A woman sweeping her porch stopped sweeping. 3 cowboys loitering near the water trough exchanged a look she knew well. The kind of look that said without a single word that they had already made up their minds about her and found the situation privately amusing. She had squared her shoulders and walked straight to the address she had written on a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket. The office of Mr. Walter Briggs, principal owner of the Briggs Cattle Station, and according to the letter she had received in Billings 6 weeks ago, the man who had advertised for a cook. The advertisement had been modest. A kitchen position, room and board, modest wages. Nothing in it had prepared her for what modest actually meant in Red Willow. Walter Briggs was a barrel-chested man with a gray mustache that he clearly considered his finest feature. He had looked up from his desk when she entered, and she had watched his expression move through 3 stages in approximately 4 seconds. Recognition, recalibration, and the particular variety of masculine discomfort that arrived when a man realized the person standing in front of him was going to require him to revise whatever he had been expecting. "You're the Collins woman," he said. Not a question, a conclusion. "I am," Maggie said. "Margaret Collins. Most people call me Maggie. You're the one who wrote about the cooking experience." 22 years of it," she said. "Homestead cooking, trail cooking, boarding house cooking. I've fed 30 men at a single sitting on nothing but what I could find in a root cellar. I'd like the position." Briggs leaned back in his chair and looked at her, the way a man looks at livestock, He's trying to decide is worth the purchase price. She let him look. She had learned early that the fastest way to unsettle a man who expected her to flinch was to simply stand still and give him nothing to work with. "The position," he said slowly, "has had some complications." "What kind of complications?" He stood up, took his hat from the peg by the door, and said, "Come on, I'll show you." He had walked her to the back of the cattle station yard, past the corrals and the equipment shed and the water barrels, to a structure sitting at the far edge of the property that she had initially assumed was a storage building no longer in use. It was not a storage building. It had once been a kitchen. Briggs stopped in front of it and crossed his arms and had the courtesy at least to look slightly embarrassed. "Used to employ a cook out here. Fellow by the name of Perkins. Left 2 years ago. Nobody's used it since." Maggie looked at the structure in silence for a long moment. The roof sagged. One entire wall section had partially collapsed inward. The door hung open at an angle that suggested the hinges had surrendered their ambitions some time ago. "It's in poor repair," she said carefully. "It's a wreck," Briggs said with the cheerfulness of a man who had decided to own the truth rather than dress it up. "But the bones are there, stove still standing, the well out back works. I can offer you the kitchen, the storage room beside it for sleeping $3 a week, and access to supplies from the station stock." He paused. "Within reason." "And what does within reason mean?" "It means I'm not running a fancy restaurant." Maggie looked at the collapsed kitchen again. She thought about the letter in her pocket, about the 3 weeks she had spent in Billings waiting for a response to any one of the 14 other positions she had applied for. She thought about the bank account that had exactly $62 in it, which was every cent she had left in the world after Thomas's debts were settled. She thought about the fact that she was 38 years old, that she had no family left to return to, that the map of her life currently had only one road marked on it, and that road led here. She put her hand out. "I'll take it," she said. Briggs shook her hand with the expression of a man who privately expected to be conducting a different kind of conversation within the month. He handed her a rusted key that unlocked a padlock on the storage room door. "Take it if you want," he said, and there was something in his voice, just a flicker of the joke he was having at her expense. Nobody else was foolish enough. Maggie took the key. She looked at him. Then maybe nobody else saw what it could become. Briggs had not answered. He had simply walked back toward the main station, and she had been left alone with the ruined kitchen and the Montana sky and the smell of dust and old ash and possibility. That had been 3 days ago. She had spent those 3 days sleeping on a bedroll in the storage room, rising before dawn each morning and working on the kitchen from the first light of the sun until she could no longer see by natural means. She had found in the station's discard pile enough lumber to brace the collapsed wall section. She had repaired the stove door with a piece of salvaged iron and the patience of a woman who had once fixed a broken wagon axle with nothing but rope and determination. She had scrubbed every surface until the old wood came back pale and clean beneath the grime. She had planted herbs. This was the detail that made the ranch hands who drifted past the far end of the yard stop and stare. A woman repairing a broken building they could understand, or at least they could file it under the category of unfortunate necessity. But a woman on her knees in the rocky Montana soil, planting rosemary and thyme and flat-leaf parsley in a row beside the kitchen door, with the focused attention of someone executing a plan, rather than performing a gesture that stopped men in their tracks in a way that a hammer and nails did not. "What's she doing?" one of the younger hands asked the man beside him one afternoon. "Gardening," the man said. "In that dirt." Apparently. They watched her for another moment. Maggie did not look up. She was measuring the spacing between her herb plants with the same precision she brought to measuring flour. "She ain't gonna make it," the first man said, but he said it quietly, and there was something in his voice that was no longer entirely certain. The person who made the most noise about her presence was not a ranch hand. His name was Charles Whitaker, and he owned the largest, and for the past decade, only restaurant in Red Willow. The Whitaker house sat on the main street of town, like a man who has positioned himself to take up as much space as possible. Broad-fronted, freshly painted with a hand-lettered sign above the door that Whitaker had paid twice the reasonable rate for because he believed in the persuasive power of good signage. Whitaker himself was a trim, precise man in his late 40s who wore his suits a size too tight and his opinions considerably tighter than that. He had come to Red Willow 12 years ago with a grubstake and a business instinct that was by any fair measure genuine. He had built the Whitaker house from nothing, had navigated drought years and boom years, and had established himself as the kind of man who knew exactly how much of the town's economic oxygen was flowing through his establishment at any given moment. The answer for 12 years had been most of it. The moment he heard that Walter Briggs had installed a cook in the abandoned kitchen behind the cattle station, Whitaker had felt a particular tightening in his chest that he recognized as the early stage of a problem. He walked to the cattle station yard that same afternoon. He stood at the edge of the property and looked at the repaired wall, the planted herbs, the thin line of smoke coming from the kitchen chimney. Because Maggie had gotten the stove working that morning, and he felt the tightening in his chest become more specific and considerably less comfortable. He went home and said nothing to anyone, but he started paying attention. The first person to eat at Maggie's table, who was not Walter Briggs or one of the station hands, was a cowboy named Samuel Carter. Samuel was 29 years old and had been riding cattle trails for 11 of those years, which meant he had eaten approximately 4,000 trail meals and had developed in response the eating habits of a man who has made a private peace with disappointment. He ate because the body required it. He chewed without tasting. He moved on. He had stopped near the cattle station that afternoon because his horse had thrown a shoe 2 miles out of town, and he had walked in on foot in the August heat, and he was thirsty and exhausted and in the kind of bleak mood that comes from a long day getting worse. He smelled the kitchen before he saw it. He stopped walking. The smell was coming from the open kitchen door, and it was the smell of beef broth that had been cooking slowly for hours of something baking of herbs. It was a smell so unexpectedly familiar, so specifically the smell of a home he had left at 18 and not been back to that. It stopped him where he stood, the way a man stops when he walks into a darkened room and someone strikes a match. He approached the kitchen door. Maggie was at the stove, her back to him, stirring something in that iron pot. She did not startle when she heard him. She simply turned around. He was looking at a woman who was large was his first thought, and then immediately with more precision, substantial present, real with flour on her forearm, and dark hair pulled back, and eyes that looked at him with the particular directness of someone who had stopped wasting time on indirectness. "You hungry?" she said. Samuel looked at her. He looked at the kitchen. He looked at the steam rising from the pot on the stove. "I could eat," he said. "Sit down then." He sat at one of the 2 repaired tables. Maggie set before him a bowl of beef stew so thick you could stand a spoon in it, a wedge of fresh cornbread that had come out of a cast-iron skillet golden and still warm, and a cup of coffee so strong and dark and perfect that he wrapped both hands around it and just held it for a moment. He picked up the spoon. He took one bite of the stew. He put the spoon down. Maggie had her back to him again, moving between the stove and the counter, and she heard the spoon set down and felt the silence behind it, and turned ready to address whatever was wrong. Samuel Carter was sitting at her table with his eyes closed and the expression of a man who has just been returned to something he thought was gone forever. "Ma'am," he said without opening his eyes. "Yes." "What is in this? Beef, potatoes, carrots, thyme from that garden out there, stock I started yesterday morning." She paused. "And a little patience." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "How much?" 30 cents for the bowl, the bread and the coffee." He reached into his vest pocket, set 2 coins on the table, and went back to eating. Maggie looked at the coins. 2 quarters, 50 cents. "You've overpaid," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said. "I know it." He ate everything. He accepted a second cup of coffee. He sat for a while after he was done in the particular way of a man who is in no hurry to leave somewhere he did not expect to find good. Then he stood, put his hat back on, and nodded at her. "I'll be back," he said. "I'll be here," Maggie said. He was back the following Tuesday. He brought 5 men with him. He had not, as far as Maggie ever knew, made any specific announcement or issued any formal invitation. He had simply in the natural course of riding and working and sitting around fires with other cowboys in the days following his first meal at her table, said what was true, that there was a woman behind the Briggs cattle station who cooked like somebody's grandmother and charged 30 cents and did not water down the coffee. That was all it took. The 5 men who came with Samuel on Tuesday were range hands from 3 different outfits, united by the common denominator of having spent too long eating food that kept the body functioning while offering the spirit nothing at all. They came in through the kitchen door with their hats in their hands, and a wariness that Maggie recognized as men who were prepared to be disappointed but were giving her the benefit of the doubt. She fed them the same way she had fed Samuel. She did not fuss. She did not explain the food. She simply placed it in front of them and let it do its work. The wariness lasted approximately 4 minutes. After that, the conversation at the table was the conversation of men who have been comfortable somewhere, which is a different thing entirely from the conversation of men who are eating because they have to. "You from Montana?" one of them asked her. He was a weathered man with a red beard named Fletcher, and he asked it the way men on the frontier asked everything directly, with the understanding that the answer would be taken at face value. "Kansas originally," Maggie said. "Came west after my husband passed." A brief silence. Hats tilted fractionally. The small, genuine ritual of men who have been raised to acknowledge loss even when they do not have the words for it. "Sorry to hear that, ma'am," Fletcher said. "Thank you kindly. You got family out here?" "Not yet," Maggie said. And she said it in a tone that made the phrase sound less like an absence and more like a direction of travel. Fletcher looked at her for a moment, then nodded and went back to his food. After they left, all 5 of them having paid what she asked, and 2 having left extra without being asked. Samuel lingered at the door. "They'll talk," he said. "About the food. You understand that?" "I'm counting on it," Maggie said. He smiled. It was a small smile, the kind a man produces when he is surprised into it. "Yes, ma'am, I expect you are?" She was. The thing that Charles Whitaker had not understood when he looked at the thin line of smoke from Maggie's chimney was this: the Whitaker house was a business. The Whitaker house offered ranch workers a transaction money for food for money end of relationship. It was adequate. It was consistent. It was the only option for so long that the men who ate there had stopped thinking of it as a choice. Maggie's kitchen was not a business. Not yet. Not the way Whitaker would have defined it. It was something older and more powerful than a business. It was a table. It was the memory of a specific memory that lived in the chest of every man who had been away from home long enough for the forgetting to start. And what Maggie Collins understood in the bone-deep way that comes from 22 years of feeding people was that the hunger a man carried after months on the trail was not primarily a hunger for food. It was a hunger for the feeling that someone had thought about him before he arrived. She thought about them, every single one. She thought about what they would be tired from. She thought about what a body needed after riding in August heat versus November cold. She thought about what a man who had been eating dried beef and hardtack for 2 weeks would feel when he tasted something braised low and slow. She thought about the weight of the coffee cup in a cold hand. She thought about the quality of the silence a person needed after a long day. Not absence of sound, but the right kind of sound, the kind that did not require anything from you. She curated that silence. She offered it alongside the food. This was the thing the men who came to her table could not have articulated if you asked them, but they felt it the moment they sat down. They felt that they had not just been fed. They had been considered. Within 2 weeks, she was feeding 20 men on a regular day and 30 on a busy one. Within 3 weeks, Walter Briggs had raised her wages without being asked, which was his closest approximation of an apology for the mocking smile with which he had handed her the key. "You're doing well," he said to her one morning, with the particular stiffness of a man who has been wrong about something and is acknowledging it obliquely rather than directly. "I am," Maggie said pleasantly, and let it sit there. It was around this time that she first became aware of Charles Whitaker watching her. She had gone into town one Tuesday morning to collect the supplies she had ordered from the dry goods store, a standing order now, which gave her a particular satisfaction, because a standing order meant reliability, and reliability meant permanence, and permanence meant she was still here. She had been loading flour sacks into the back of the station's small wagon when she noticed the man standing across the street. He was well dressed. He stood very straight. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, not cruelty, exactly. Not yet, but the careful calculation of a man who is adding up figures and not liking what the sum comes to. She looked back at him. He did not look away. Neither did she. After a moment, he turned and walked back into the Whitaker house, and the door closed behind him with a firmness that said everything his expression had left unspoken. Maggie loaded the last flour sack and climbed up onto the wagon seat. She drove back to the cattle station. She was not afraid of Charles Whitaker, but she was not naive about him either. She knew what it meant when a man who had held a monopoly for 12 years looked at a new option the way you look at something you intend to remove. She also knew that the best response to that kind of attention was not to prepare for a fight. It was to become so indispensable that fighting her cost more than leaving her alone. So she cooked. She cooked the way she always had, not as performance, not as competition, but as a woman expressing the most fundamental conviction of her life, which was that feeding people well was an act of love, and that love practiced consistently and without expectation of reciprocity had a cumulative power that no amount of calculation could fully account for. She experimented. She had brought west with her a collection of recipes written on worn paper in her grandmother's hand, in her mother's hand, and in her own hand. A document that spanned 3 generations of women who had each in their own time and circumstance understood that the table was where the world's worst damages got undone, one meal at a time. She added a spiced apple cake that she had been making since she was 19 because the apples at the station's fruit press were just coming ripe, and she had 3 dozen of them going soft. She made it on a Thursday. By Saturday, every man who had eaten a slice had mentioned it to at least 2 other men. She made sourdough bread because a woman at the Billings boarding house had given her a starter culture and instructions, and because real bread with structure and flavor and a crust that cracked when you pressed it, was something that reduced grown men to the kind of silence that preceded gratitude. She made posole on a Wednesday, a recipe from a woman she had worked beside years ago in a Kansas kitchen, and 6 of the men at her table that evening had never eaten anything like it. She watched them work through their uncertainty, the cautious first spoonful, the recalibration, the second spoonful, taken with more confidence, and she felt the specific satisfaction of having introduced someone to a pleasure they did not know they were missing. "What do you call this?" one of them asked. "Posole," she said. "It's made with hominy, old recipe." "It's good," he said, which was high praise from a man for whom the vocabulary of food appreciation had not had much occasion to develop. "Thank you," she said. "I'll make it again." And through all of it, the expanding menu, the growing number of men at her tables, the careful cultivation of a kitchen that felt like a place rather than a service, she was also watching. She was watching for the moment Charles Whitaker stopped calculating and started acting. It came on a day in late September, 6 weeks after she had set her iron pot on that broken stove for the first time. She went to collect her weekly supply order from the dry goods store and found the owner a cautious man named Aldrich standing behind his counter with the expression of a man who would very much prefer to be somewhere else. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "I'm afraid there's a problem with your order." Maggie looked at the counter. It was empty. "What kind of problem?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "I'm not able to fill it," Aldrich said. He would not meet her eyes. "The flour, the sugar, the coffee, I don't have sufficient stock." She looked at him. He looked at his counter. They both knew that the supply wagon had come in on Friday because she had seen it from the road on her way into town. "I see," Maggie said. Aldrich shifted his weight. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Collins. I truly am." She believed he was sorry. She did not believe he was sorry enough to do anything about it. She walked out of the dry goods store and stood on the main street of Red Willow for a moment in the September morning, and she looked down the street at the Whitaker house, which was open and active, and whose supply shelves she had no doubt were fully stocked. She felt the anger arrive. She let herself feel it, the heat of it, the justice of it, the particular fury that comes from being targeted by someone who mistakes your gentleness for weakness, and then she set it down. Not because the anger wasn't right. Because she had something more useful than anger. She had ingredients. She walked back to the cattle station. She stood in her kitchen and looked at what she had. Potatoes. A sack and a half of them, the red willow variety that ran small and starchy and cooked up soft. Eggs 2 dozen from the chickens she had quietly established in a small coop behind the storage room over the past month. Vegetables from her garden: carrots, parsnips, the last of the summer beans. 4 cuts of beef from the station's remaining stock. A tin of baking powder. Cornmeal. She put on her apron. She started a fire under the stove. She thought about every meal she had ever made from almost nothing. She thought about the winter when she and Thomas had fed 14 people for 6 weeks on what was left in the root cellar. She thought about the boarding house in Abilene, where the supply delivery had been 3 days late, and she had kept 40 people fed on creativity and patience. She thought about her grandmother's voice, low and steady. Girl, a cook who can only cook when she has everything she needs isn't much of a cook. She built a potato stew with the beef seasoned with what grew at her back door. Rosemary, thyme, the dried chilies she had traded for with a passing Mexican drover 3 weeks ago. She made cornbread from the meal rich with eggs and just enough fat to give it a tenderness that flour alone would not have produced. She braised the beef cuts low and slow with the last of her dried onions and a splash of the apple cider she had been keeping in the cool of the storage room. And for dessert, because she refused to be diminished by a man who thought cutting off her flour would cut off her spirit. She made a skillet cake from eggs and cornmeal and honey and whatever dried fruit she had left, sweetened with the last of her maple syrup. She cooked all day. 20 men arrived at her tables that evening. They arrived expecting what they'd had before. They got something different. They got something better. Samuel Carter was among them. He watched her move through the kitchen with the calm efficiency of a woman who had made peace with her circumstances, and when she set the stew in front of him, he looked up at her. "Supply trouble?" he asked. She looked at him. "Nothing I couldn't work around," she said. He ate in silence for a moment. Then quietly, so the other men wouldn't hear, "Was it Whitaker?" Maggie looked at him. She considered the question, not the answer which she knew, but the question of what her answer should do in the world if she spoke it aloud. "I came here to build something," she said, "not to fight someone." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when he has understood something that was not said in words. He told 2 men that story. Those 2 men told 6. By the following Sunday, there were cowboys riding in from outfits 20 miles from Red Willow because they had heard about the woman behind the cattle station who, when someone tried to shut her down, made the best meal of the season out of what was left in her kitchen. Word on the frontier traveled fast, and the word about Maggie Collins had become the kind of word that traveled fastest of all. Not gossip, not rumor, but the kind of story a man tells around a fire at the end of a hard day, because he needs to tell a story that ends with something going right. Maggie Collins had been handed the ruins, and she had made the ruins into something worth writing for. Walter Briggs found her at the end of that long Monday evening, after the last man had eaten, and the tables were cleared, and she was scrubbing down the stove in the thin lamplight. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "I heard about the supply problem," he said. "I handled it," Maggie said without turning around. "I know you did." A pause. 23 men for dinner tonight. That's a record." "Give me a month," Maggie said. "I'll double it." Another pause. When Briggs spoke again, his voice had lost the last remnant of that mocking quality, the tone of a man who has offered someone the ruins as a joke and is reckoning for the first time with the fact that the joke has entirely reversed itself. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "is there anything you need?" Maggie set down her scrubbing brush. She turned around. She looked at Walter Briggs, this man who had handed her the key with a smile that said he expected her gone within the month. This man who had underestimated her so completely and so casually that she had not even been worth a real challenge, and she let herself feel for just a moment the full quiet weight of what she had built in 6 weeks with $3 a week and a stove that had been 1 season away from collapse. She thought about what she needed. Then she told him. "A proper roof," she said. "Before winter." Briggs looked at her. Then he nodded. "Done," he said. And for the first time since she had arrived in Red Willow, Montana territory in the summer of 1887, Margaret Collins allowed herself to smile. Not because the worst was over. She knew it wasn't. Whitaker was still out there. The town was still watching. There were men in Red Willow who had not yet decided what to make of her, and some who had decided wrong, and some who would not come around until something happened that left them no graceful alternative. But in this moment, in this kitchen that she had brought back from nothing, with the smell of the evening's cooking, still warm in the walls, and the lamplight making the scrubbed wood glow the color of old honey, she let herself feel what she had earned. She was still here. She had said she would not leave this town the way they expected her to. She was keeping that promise. The iron pot sat on the clean stove behind her, and the herbs were growing beside the door, and somewhere out in the dark of the Montana night, there were 23 men who had ridden to her table and left full in a way that went deeper than the body. She had built that. She had built it from the ruins, from the discards, from the broken things nobody else wanted, and she was just getting started. The roof went up in October. Briggs sent 3 men over on a Tuesday morning with fresh lumber and new shingles, and Maggie stood in her kitchen doorway and watched them work and felt something she had not felt in a long time. The specific grounded satisfaction of a promise being kept. Not a promise made to her in softness or sentiment, but a practical promise, a frontier promise, the kind that meant someone had decided she was worth the lumber. She did not make a show of it. She simply went back inside and started her morning prep. But she did make the workers a proper lunch. Cornbread, beef and bean stew, fresh brewed coffee and a wedge of spiced apple cake each. The foreman, a quiet man named Decker, with sawdust permanently embedded in his beard, ate 3 pieces of cornbread and then sat at her table for a full 10 minutes after he was done. Not speaking, just existing in the warmth of the kitchen, with the particular stillness of a man who is reluctant to go back out into the cold. "Mrs. Collins," he finally said. "Yes, I've been building things in this territory for 14 years. He paused. "Worked on the Whitaker house, built the post office, put a new floor in the church." Another pause longer. "I don't think I've ever eaten a better meal than what you just put in front of me." Maggie set down the dishcloth she was holding. She looked at him. "Mr. Decker," she said, "you just made my entire Tuesday." He laughed, a short, surprised sound, as if laughter was a room he hadn't entered in a while and had forgotten the way to. Then he put his hat on and went back to work, and Maggie listened to the hammering above her head and thought that the sound of someone repairing what was broken might be the best sound she knew. By the time the first snow fell on Red Willow that November, Maggie's kitchen had a solid roof, 2 new windows she had bartered for, with a month of Sunday lunches, to the glass merchant's family, and a reputation that had traveled so far beyond the cattle station that she had stopped being surprised by the faces she didn't recognize sitting at her tables. Men came from Lander Creek, 12 miles east. They came from the Rocking Tea Ranch, which was 17 miles west, and whose foreman, a deliberate man named Hatch, had heard about her cooking from 3 separate sources before he finally made the ride himself. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, sat down without introducing himself, ate 2 full bowls of her venison and root vegetable stew, and then said matter-of-factly, as though he was reporting the weather, "I'll be sending my boys in on Fridays from here on." "I'll have enough for them," Maggie said. "How many can you seat?" She looked around the kitchen. The 2 original tables. 3 more she had added. The long bench Samuel and 2 of his outfit had built from leftover lumber after the roof was done. 25 comfortably, she said. 30 if nobody minds being friendly. Hatch almost smiled. Cowboys don't mind being friendly when the food's worth it. He stood, left exact payment plus $1, and rode back west. The following Friday, 6 men from the Rocking Tea arrived at noon and filled half her tables before the regular crowd from the cattle station had even sat down. Maggie had anticipated this. She had been anticipating things all her life. It was, she had come to understand one of her most fundamental skills. Not the cooking itself, which was craft and could be learned, but the ability to look at a situation and see what it was moving toward before it arrived. She had seen the roof coming before Briggs offered it. She had seen the growing crowd before Samuel's friends brought their friends. She had seen from the moment she watched Charles Whitaker standing across that street exactly what kind of problem he intended to become. What she had not fully anticipated was Martha. Martha Aldrich was the wife of the dry goods store owner, the same Aldrich who had refused to fill her supply order that Monday in September, who had stood behind his counter with the expression of a man drowning slowly in a pond of his own moral cowardice. Martha was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s who moved through Red Willow with the efficiency of someone who had long ago decided that the world's noise was mostly wasted air and who reserved her attention for what was actually worth it. She came to the kitchen on a Thursday morning in November, before the lunch crowd, when Maggie was alone with her prep work and the sound of the wind coming off the plains. She knocked on the open door. Maggie turned from the stove. The two women looked at each other. "Mrs. Collins," Martha said. "Mrs. Aldrich," Maggie said. A silence. The particular kind that exists between two women who understand each other's situation completely and are negotiating in real time whether to say so. Martha stepped inside. She set a wrapped bundle on the counter. "From my pantry," she said. 2 pounds of flour. Coffee beans 1/4 pound. Baking powder." She paused. "I'm sorry for what my husband did in September. He isn't a bad man. He's a frightened one. That's not the same thing, but it doesn't make it right." Maggie looked at the bundle. Then she looked at Martha. "Thank you," she said. "I'll see to it that your regular order comes through without interference from here on." Martha's voice was precise and utterly final. The voice of a woman who has made a decision after careful thought and will not be revisited on it. Charles Whitaker does not own this town, though he has spent 12 years behaving as though he does, and I have watched enough people shrink to fit his comfort. Something shifted in the room. Maggie pulled the kettle off the back of the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of Martha. Martha Aldrich sat down at Maggie's table, wrapped her hands around the cup, and for the first time in what Maggie suspected was a very long time, Martha Aldrich simply sat somewhere and let herself be still. They talked for an hour. Martha told her which suppliers were genuinely short on stock and which were being pressured. She told her which ranchers in the surrounding valleys were sympathetic and which were in Whitaker's pocket. She told her quietly and without drama exactly how Charles Whitaker had built his influence in Red Willow, not through genuine authority, but through the slow, patient accumulation of people who owed him favors and were afraid of what happened when they stopped owing. Maggie listened. She did not take notes. She did not need to. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life reading rooms, reading people, reading the invisible architecture of how a community held itself together or pulled itself apart. When Martha stood to leave, she paused at the door. "He's going to come at you harder," she said. It was not a warning delivered in fear. It was information. "He doesn't know yet that he's already losing, but when he figures it out..." She stopped. "Just know that you have more people on your side than you can see right now." "Thank you, Martha," Maggie said. Martha nodded once, put her hat on, and walked back into the November cold. Maggie stood in her kitchen for a moment after she left. Then she unwrapped the bundle on the counter, put the flour on the shelf, and went back to work. The harder push came 2 weeks later, and it came from a direction Maggie had not fully mapped. It was not the supply chain this time. Whitaker had apparently understood that that approach had not only failed, but had backfired, had turned Maggie's resilience into a story that people were repeating with obvious admiration. He was smarter than a direct repeat of a failed strategy. This time, it was the ranchers. 3 of the largest cattle operations in the valley outfits that between them employed close to 60 men, sent word to their range bosses that the men were not to ride to the Collins kitchen on company time. The official reason was productivity. The real reason was that the owners of those 3 operations had all at one point or another borrowed money from Charles Whitaker, and Whitaker had called in the favor. Samuel told her on a Monday evening after the dinner crowd had thinned out. He sat at the corner table where he had taken to sitting when he came in late, the one against the far wall where he could see both the kitchen and the door, and he turned his coffee cup in his hands and said it plain. "Harker's the Double Cross and the Vista Ridge outfit," he said. "Their men have been told to stay away." Maggie went very still. Those 3 outfits had been accounting for nearly 30 men on any given day. 30 men. "I see," she said. "Maggie." It was the first time Samuel Carter had used her given name. They both noticed it. He didn't take it back. "This ain't something you can cook your way around." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "Whitaker's calling in debts. Men who owe him don't have a choice." "Men always have a choice," Maggie said. "Sometimes it's just a worse one than they'd like." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that had been growing there over the past weeks. Something she had been careful not to examine too closely because she had enough to carry without adding complications. It was the look of a man who has started paying attention in a particular and specific way, the way you pay attention to something you're afraid might disappear. "What are you going to do?" he said. Maggie poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table across from him, which she almost never did. She was almost always on her feet, moving, working. Sitting down across from Samuel Carter in her own kitchen, at the end of a long day, felt like stepping across a line she had been standing beside for weeks. She wrapped her hands around her cup. "I'm going to open early tomorrow," she said. 5 o'clock in the morning. Cowboys from those outfits come through on the way to the eastern ranges at dawn. Company time starts when they arrive at the range. Before that," she paused. "Before that, they're their own men." Samuel stared at her. 5 o'clock, he said. "I'll have biscuits and coffee and whatever meat is left from today ready to go. A man can eat a real breakfast in 20 minutes and still make his range by sunup." Another silence. Then Samuel Carter did something she had not seen him do before. He put his face in his hands, not in despair, but in the particular posture of a man trying to contain something that wanted to come out of his chest as laughter, or tears, or some mixture of both. When he looked up, his eyes were bright. "Ma'am," he said, "you are something else entirely." Maggie took a sip of her coffee. "I'm a cook," she said. "I've always been a cook. The difference is now I'm a cook with a roof." He laughed. Genuinely. The sound of it in her kitchen felt like something she wanted to remember. She was up at 4 the next morning. The biscuits were in the cast iron before the darkness had even begun to thin. She had the coffee going and the leftover brisket from the previous day, sliced and warming on the back burner, and she propped open the kitchen door and waited. The first rider came past at 5 past 5, heading east on the Valley Road. A young Harker's hand named Billy, who was 16 and had been eating at her kitchen for 2 months before the band came down, and had looked genuinely bereft about it when it ended. He saw the light. He slowed. He stopped. He looked at the open door. "Mrs. Collins," he called. "Billy," she said. "You hungry?" He was off his horse in about 4 seconds. He sat at her table and ate 3 biscuits with gravy and 2 cups of coffee in 15 minutes left. 35 cents on the table, and was back on his horse and down the Valley Road before sunup. 12 minutes later, 2 more Harker's men came past. Both of them stopped. Within a week, Maggie was serving breakfast to 23 men before 6 in the morning, all of them in and out before the ranch day started, all of them navigating the letter of their employer's instruction, while decisively violating its spirit. She did not feel guilty about this. The instruction itself was illegitimate. A powerful man using debt to control where other men spent their own time and their own money. What she felt was something closer to satisfaction, the kind that comes from solving a problem with precision. But the 30 men at the breakfast table meant something beyond the practical victory, and she knew it, and it was making her careful in a way she had not had to be careful before. Because 23 cold, grateful cowboys walking into a warm kitchen before dawn were not just customers. They were, she had seen it happen before, and she recognized the signs they were becoming something more like devotees. And devotees, she knew, could complicate things in ways that simple customers did not. She saw it in how they talked to her, in how some of them had begun staying longer than they needed to, in how 2 or 3 of the younger ones had started finding small reasons to come back in the evenings. A broken wagon part. They needed to borrow a tool to fix a message. They were passing along a question about nothing that was transparently a pretense to sit at her table for another 20 minutes. She managed it gently and with great care. She was warm with all of them. She was not intimate with any of them. She had learned that particular skill during the boarding house years when she had been the only woman among 30 men for months at a time. How to be genuinely kind while remaining clearly herself. How to make everyone at her table feel welcomed without making anyone feel singled out. It was Samuel who named what was happening one morning when he arrived early enough to be alone with her before the others came. He sat at the corner table with his coffee and watched her moving between the stove and the counter, and he said without preamble, "Half these boys are in love with you, you know." Maggie did not stop what she was doing. "Half these boys," she said, "are in love with a warm meal and someone who looked them in the eye when she set it down. That's a different thing." "Is it?" She turned around and looked at him. Samuel Carter was sitting at her corner table in the early morning light, his hat pushed back on his head, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, watching her with an expression that was entirely specific and not remotely ambiguous. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "It is." A beat. "Usually," Samuel said. He took a sip of his coffee. She went back to the biscuits, but the warmth in her chest from that exchange stayed with her for the entire rest of the morning, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it was there, even if she was not yet ready to decide what to do about it. The first real violence came in December, not physical violence. Red Willow was a rough place, but it was not lawless, and Charles Whitaker was too careful and too vain a man to expose himself to anything that crude. The violence was economic, and it was elegant in its way, and it came from an angle she had not fully protected. The station's supply connection to the railhead at Billings ran through a freight consolidator named Morse, who combined orders from the surrounding ranches and cattle operations into single shipments for cost efficiency. Maggie's supply orders had been riding in the consolidated shipment for the past 2 months, which had dramatically reduced her costs. In early December, she found out that Morse had been bought out. The buyer was a holding company in Helena. The holding company she discovered 3 days later through Martha Aldrich, who had discovered it through her cousin, who worked in Helena property records, was wholly owned by one Charles R. Whitaker. Her consolidation rate disappeared overnight. The direct shipping cost from Billings would triple her supply expenses. She ran the numbers. She ran them twice. Then she sat in her kitchen on a cold December morning and looked at the numbers on the paper in front of her, and she let herself feel fully, without flinching, the enormity of what Whitaker had done. Not the anger. She had been managing the anger for months. The specific weight of it, the precision of his planning, the patience of it, the resources he had deployed. The fact that he had waited until she had built something real and then targeted the foundation rather than the walls. I was not trying to slow her down. He was trying to make it impossible for her to continue. She sat with that for a long while. Then she put the paper down and went to the stove. She made herself a proper breakfast: eggs, the good bacon she had been saving, sourdough toast, and she sat down and ate it slowly and thought about her grandmother, who had survived 3 crop failures and a war and raised 5 children and had never once, that Maggie knew of, allowed a situation to decide her future before she had personally exhausted every available alternative. By the time she finished eating, she had a list. Not a list on paper. A list in her mind, which was where she kept the things she was serious about. First, she needed her own supply line. Independent of Morse. Independent of any channel Whitaker could buy. Second, she needed people. Not employees. Partners. She thought about every person who had sat at her table in the past 4 months. She thought about what she knew of them, not just their names and their outfits, but the texture of their situations, the specifics of what they needed and what they had. A cook of 22 years had a particular kind of knowledge about people. You learned things about a person from what they ordered and what they left on the plate and how they held themselves when they were tired. She had been storing all of it without knowing exactly why, and now the reason was becoming clear. Hatch, the rocking tea foreman, had mentioned once that his operation grew more potatoes than they could sell and had been losing a portion to rot each year for lack of buyers. Maggie had stored that. A farmer named Reese, who came in from 10 miles northeast on occasional Saturdays, had mentioned that he slaughtered a cow every 4 to 6 weeks and had been selling the beef below value because the Billings buyers set the price. Maggie had stored that. A woman named Clara, who ran the boarding house on the south end of Red Willow, had mentioned in the brief conversation they'd had outside the post office that she baked bread every morning and usually had surplus that went stale. Maggie had stored that too. She sat down and wrote 3 letters. Then she put on her coat and walked into town. She found Martha Aldrich first. "I need to talk to 3 people," she said. "And I need someone with me who this town takes seriously." Martha looked at her. "Tell me where," she said. They spent the afternoon visiting Hatch, Reese, and Clara. Maggie laid out what she needed: direct supply relationships, bypassing the billings consolidator entirely, and what she was offering in return. Consistent purchase contracts, fair prices, negotiated upfront payment within 7 days of delivery. Real agreements, not handshake agreements. Written ones. Hatch listened to her in his ranch office for 12 minutes without saying anything. Then he said, "You're cutting Whitaker out of your supply chain." "I'm building my own," Maggie said, "which is different." "It amounts to the same thing from his perspective." "That's his problem," Maggie said. "My problem is feeding 60 people a day through a Montana winter. Are you in or not?" Hatch looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up the pen on his desk. Reese agreed in 4 minutes. Clara took 6. By the time the sun went down, Maggie had 3 signed supply agreements in her coat pocket and a supply chain that owed nothing to anyone Charles Whitaker could reach. Martha walked back toward town beside her in the early evening dark, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she said, "You know he's going to find out." "I know," Maggie said, "and he's going to be angry." "I know that too." "Are you frightened?" Maggie walked in silence for a moment. The cold air was sharp and clean, and above them the Montana sky was dense with stars, and below it the lights of Red Willow were small and warm and far away, and she thought about the iron pot on her stove, and the herbs outside her kitchen door, and the 50 cents Samuel Carter had left on her table the very first day. "No," she said. "I'm not frightened." She paused. "I think he is." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said finally. "I think you might be right." Word came back to her 4 days later through Samuel that Whitaker had heard about the supply agreements and had reacted with a fury he apparently made no effort to conceal. He had summoned the 3 ranchers to his office, Hatch, Reese, and Clara's husband, who handled her business affairs, and had laid out in language that left no ambiguity what he expected from people who wanted to maintain their relationship with him. Hatch told him, according to Samuel, to go to hell. Reese had apparently said something briefer and considerably more anatomical. Clara's husband had walked out of the meeting without speaking at all, which, given the circumstances, communicated everything it needed to. When Samuel told her this, sitting at her corner table with his second cup of the evening, Maggie felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in months. Hope, not the fragile contingent kind that asks permission to exist. The solid kind. The kind built on evidence. "They're not afraid of him anymore," she said. "Some of them weren't afraid of him to begin with," Samuel said. "Some of them were just short on reasons to say so out loud." He looked at her. "You gave them a reason." The kitchen was quiet around them. The evening crowd had gone. The stove ticked in the cold. Outside, the December wind moved across the plains with a sound like distant water. And Maggie sat across from Samuel Carter in the lamplight and thought that this moment, this exact, unremarkable, specific moment, was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing needed to. "Samuel," she said. "Yes, thank you for all of it, from the first day." He looked at his coffee cup. Something moved across his face, the particular discomfort of a man who is not accustomed to being thanked for the things he is most serious about. "You didn't need my help," he said. "No," Maggie said, "but I was glad to have it." A long pause. "Maggie," he said, and again the use of her name. She had stopped pretending she didn't notice it. "Yes." He looked up from his cup. He looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her from the beginning, without the evasiveness that men sometimes deployed around her, as though her directness required the protection of indirection. He had always met her head on. It was the thing about him she had been most careful not to think about too much. "I would very much like," he said slowly, "to come to dinner. Not to the kitchen. Somewhere." He paused. "Somewhere that isn't about the food." Maggie looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "That is going to require me to cook something even better than what you've been getting." Samuel Carter smiled. And outside, the December wind came off the Montana plains and rattled the new roof that Briggs had put on for her, and the stove ticked warm in the corner, and Maggie Collins, who had arrived in Red Willow with nothing but a wooden trunk and an iron pot, and a refusal to be what anyone expected her to be, allowed herself for just a moment to be happy. She had not finished fighting Charles Whitaker. She knew that. Whatever was coming next, she could feel it, the way you feel. Weather before it arrives. A pressure change, a shift in the light. Something moving toward you across the flat open land of the future. But right now, tonight, in this kitchen, she had dragged back from ruin with her own 2 hands, with a solid roof over her head, and 3 supply contracts in her pocket, and a good man sitting at her corner table watching her with something she had almost stopped believing she deserved to be looked at with. Right now was enough. She stood up and started washing the last of the evening's cups, and the sound of the water, and the wind, and Samuel's quiet presence in the corner were the only sounds in the world. And Maggie Collins thought that maybe, possibly after everything, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The dinner happened on a Thursday. Samuel came at 7. After the last of the evening crowd had gone, and he came wearing a clean shirt that Maggie suspected he had pressed himself, because the collar had that particular careful iron look of a man doing something he was not entirely practiced at. He had combed his hair. He had left his spurs at the door without being asked, which told her something about him that she had already suspected, but was glad to have confirmed. She had cooked the way she cooked when she was cooking for herself. Not the large batch practical cooking of the kitchen at full service, but the slower, more considered cooking of someone who has chosen every single ingredient with a specific person in mind. A roast chicken with herbs from her garden, the skin pressed crisp and golden. Roasted root vegetables with a drizzle of the good honey Reese had included with his last delivery. Bread she had started that morning and let rise all day. A bottle of wine that Martha Aldrich had appeared with 2 days earlier, without explanation, setting it on Maggie's counter, and walking out again before Maggie could ask questions. They sat at the small table by the window. They talked for 3 hours. Maggie learned that Samuel had been born in Tennessee, that he had left at 17 after his father died, and there was nothing left on the land worth staying for, that he had been moving west and north ever since, in the incremental, directionless way of a man following work rather than destination. He had never owned anything larger than a horse. He had never stayed anywhere longer than 2 seasons. He had never, he said with a directness that surprised even him, sat at a table with someone and felt like the table was where he was supposed to be. "That's a big thing to say over a first dinner," Maggie said. "I know it." He looked at her. "I've been practicing restraint for 4 months. I figure I've earned 1 honest sentence." She laughed. It was the laugh that had been living in her chest for weeks, the one she had been too busy and too careful to let out, and it came out now, full and unguarded and entirely itself. And Samuel Carter looked at her when she laughed with the expression of a man who has just realized he is in serious trouble and is completely at peace with that fact. They did not discuss Whitaker. They did not discuss supply chains or ranchers or the freight consolidator in Helena. They talked about Tennessee and Kansas and what it was like to grow up knowing how to do one thing very well and spending your whole life figuring out whether that one thing was enough. They talked about loss. Thomas's name came into the conversation gently, without ceremony, the way the name of someone important enters a conversation between 2 people who are becoming real to each other. Samuel did not flinch from it. He asked a single question. Was he a good man? And Maggie said yes, he was, and Samuel nodded and said nothing else, which was exactly right. When he left, he stood at the kitchen door for a moment with his hat in his hands. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome. Same time next Thursday." She looked at him. "I'll start the bread Wednesday evening," she said. He smiled, put his hat on, walked into the December night. Maggie stood in her kitchen for a long moment after the sound of his horse faded down the valley road, and she pressed both hands flat on the counter and let herself feel the entirety of it. The fear and the warmth and the particular vertigo of caring about something new, when you have already lost things you cared about. And then she took a breath and went to wash the dishes. She was still standing at the wash basin when Charles Whitaker made his next move. She didn't know it yet. She found out the following morning when Billy, the young Harker's hand, who had been the first man through her door at 5 a.m, came pounding on the kitchen door before the fire was even properly started, his face flushed from the cold and from something else, something urgent. "Mrs. Collins." He was breathing hard. "There's a man from the county assessor's office in town. Arrived on last night's coach. He's got papers." Maggie set down the coffee pot. "What kind of papers?" "I don't rightly know, but Mr. Hatch sent me ahead to warn you. He said Whitaker's been in Helena." She was in town by 8 o'clock. The man from the county assessor's office was named Pruitt, and he was the kind of small, self-important official who wore his authority like a hat 2 sizes too large. He was set up in the post office with a leather document case and the expression of a man who considered delivering bad news an acceptable form of job satisfaction. Maggie walked in without knocking. "I'm Margaret Collins," she said. "I understand you have papers that concern my establishment." Pruitt looked up. He looked at her the way men like him always looked at women like her. The brief inventory, the rapid recalibration, the decision to proceed with condescension anyway. "Mrs. Collins." He sorted through his case. "The Briggs Cattle Station kitchen is currently operating under a residential designation. As of January the 1st, any commercial food service operation within Red Willow commercial premises license payable quarterly." He found the paper he was looking for and laid it on the counter. "The fee is $40 per quarter." Maggie looked at the paper. She kept her face entirely still. $40 a quarter was $160 a year. Her current profit after the new supply agreements and the expanded service was running approximately $3 a day on busy days. $160 was nearly 2 months of clear profit. Profit she needed for expansion for the kitchen equipment she was planning to purchase in the spring for the contingency reserve that any business needed to survive the unpredictable. $160 was not impossible, but it was designed to be painful, and she knew without having to ask that the Whitaker house had been operating under a commercial designation for 12 years and was paying a fee that Pruitt would not be able to quote her off the top of his head because it had been set before this particular ordinance existed and had never been revisited. "When was this ordinance passed?" she said. Pruitt blinked. "I beg your pardon. The commercial premises ordinance. When was it enacted?" He rifled through his papers. "The county commissioners voted on it in..." "When?" "October," he said. "October 14th. October 14th. 6 weeks after her kitchen had started drawing 30 men a day. 6 weeks after Charles Whitaker had begun losing customers he had considered captive." "I see," Maggie said. She picked up the paper, folded it twice, and put it in her coat pocket. "You'll have my response within the week," she said. Pruitt blinked again. He had clearly expected tears or argument or collapse. He had not expected the paper to disappear into a coat pocket with the calm efficiency of a woman who was already 3 moves ahead. "The deadline for..." "I heard you," Maggie said. "Good morning." She walked out. She walked directly to the office of the county's resident solicitor, a man named Gant, whom she had met exactly once at the church social in October, and who had eaten at her kitchen twice since then, and had on both occasions left considerably more than the asking price on the table. Gant was in his office. She laid the paper on his desk. He read it. He read it again. Then he leaned back in his chair and said with the measured calm of a man who is angry but has chosen to express it through precision, "This is targeted legislation. The ordinance was written specifically to create a cost burden for one operation." "Can it be fought?" Maggie said. "It can." He picked up the paper and looked at it again. "But county commission fights take time. Months, possibly. The fee is due January 1st regardless of any challenge." "Then I pay January 1st, Maggie said, "and we fight it after." Gant looked at her. "The fee." "I know what the fee is," she said. "I know what it costs me. I also know that if I don't pay it and operate without the license, he wins by default, and I'm shut down." She paused. "Shutting me down is what he wants. Paying the fee keeps me open, and I intend to stay open." Gant studied her for a long moment. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "you are the most tactically clear-headed person I have had in this office in 3 years." "I'm a woman who has been cornered before," she said. "I've learned that the corner is just a wall. Walls can be climbed." She went back to the kitchen. She told no one about the fee, except Samuel that evening, and Martha the following morning. She did not want it to become a story of victimhood, did not want the men at her tables eating their meals with the weight of her trouble on their consciences. She wanted them to come because the food was good and the kitchen was warm, and it made them feel something worth feeling. Not because they felt sorry for her, but the town was small, and Pruitt had not been discreet, and by Friday, half of Red Willow knew that the county assessor had come calling, and that the Collins kitchen was facing a $40 quarterly fee that had appeared from nowhere in October. The reaction surprised her. It started with Hatch. He came in on Friday afternoon, not his usual day, not his usual time, and sat at the corner table and drank a cup of coffee, and said without any preamble or performance, "Me and 6 of the other outfit bosses have been talking. We want to cover the first quarter's fee." Maggie stopped what she was doing. "Absolutely not," she said. "Maggie. No." Her voice was not angry. It was clear. Entirely clear, the way good water is clear without turbulence. "I'm grateful, I mean that. But this kitchen stands on its own, or it doesn't stand. I didn't come here to be someone's charity case." "It's not charity," Hatch said. "It's an investment. Every one of those men has a crew that eats here. You go under our crews, eat at Whitaker's again. I'd rather fund a fight than fund a monopoly." Maggie looked at him. He had a point. She recognized it. She also recognized the specific difference between a thing that looked like help and was actually control, and a thing that genuinely was what it said it was. She thought about it for a full 10 seconds, which was longer than she usually needed. "Half," she said. "What?" "You can contribute half the first quarter's fee. Combined, all of you. I pay the other half. And we call it a loan, not a gift with a repayment schedule I set." Hatch looked at her for a moment. Then he put out his hand. She shook it. The contribution came in over the following week, in amounts that ranged from Hatch's deliberate $5 to a crumpled dollar bill that Billy left on the counter without saying anything and was back out the door before she could respond. By Christmas Eve, she had $21 in a tin on the kitchen shelf with a paper that listed every contributor's name and the amount they had given because she intended to repay every cent. Christmas Day itself arrived cold and still. Most of the Cowboys would be at their outfits. Maggie had told herself she would take the day quiet, maybe a small meal for herself, sometime with the recipes her grandmother had left her, the ordinary restorative pleasure of a day without 60 people to feed. At 6 in the morning, she heard a knock at the kitchen door. She opened it. Samuel was standing there with his hat in his hand and snow in his hair, and a look on his face that was trying very hard to be casual and not succeeding particularly well. "I brought something," he said. He was carrying a small spruce bough tied with a piece of red cloth and a wrapped parcel that turned out to contain 2 sweet oranges and a small bottle of whiskey. Maggie looked at him. She looked at the spruce bough. "Samuel Carter," she said, "did you ride through a snowstorm to bring me a Christmas branch?" "It wasn't a storm," he said. "More of a strong suggestion of snow." She stepped back from the door. He came in. They spent Christmas morning together in the kitchen, just the 2 of them. The spruce bough leaned against the window, and the smell of the oranges in the warm air, and the whiskey opened for the coffee because it was Christmas, and some traditions were non-negotiable. They talked and cooked and were quiet in the comfortable way that people are quiet together when they have stopped performing ease and actually arrived at it. At midday, without any prior arrangement, Fletcher showed up. Then 2 of the rocking tea men. Then Billy, who had apparently had nowhere else to go, and had decided that nowhere else was precisely where the Collins kitchen was. In the afternoon, there were 11 people at Maggie's tables on Christmas Day, eating the meal she had started preparing the moment she realized she was cooking for more than one. It was the best Christmas she had spent in years. She did not say so aloud, but Samuel saw it on her face, and she knew he saw it, and she did not look away. January came in hard. The first week of the new year brought 2 days of temperatures that dropped past anything reasonable. A supply delivery that was 3 days late, due to drifted roads and a notice from Pruitt that her commercial license application was being reviewed by the county and would not be finalized until a hearing could be scheduled. A hearing. She read the notice twice. A hearing meant a public proceeding. A public proceeding meant testimony. It meant Whitaker or his representatives could appear and argue against her license being granted. It meant that the $40 she had scraped together was not the end of the matter, but the beginning of a longer, more exposed fight. She went to Gant. He was already waiting for her. "I expected this," he said. "Whitaker has a contact on the county commission, a man named Ferris. He'll argue that the existing commercial ordinance already covers the territory and that a new license creates unfair competition with established businesses." He paused. "Which is extraordinary given that the ordinance was created specifically to burden you. But that is the kind of argument that sounds reasonable to people who are not paying close attention." "When is the hearing?" Maggie said. 3 weeks, February 8th. 3 weeks, she nodded. "Who sits on the commission?" Gant listed 5 names. She listened. 3 of the names she knew from her tables. Not personally the way she knew Samuel or Martha or Hatch, but in the way she knew every man who had ever sat across from her and been fed by what they ordered and how they ate, and the quality of their silence after the meal. She knew those 3 men in the particular way she knew things, through the body's involuntary honesty. One of them left extra every single time. One of them had told her once with the gruff embarrassment of a man who is not accustomed to saying things like this, that her sourdough tasted exactly like his mother's. The third had brought his teenage son to lunch 2 Saturdays in a row and watched the boy eat with the expression of a father who was giving his son something good to remember. "Tell me about Ferris," she said. Gant leaned back. "He's been in Whitaker's pocket for 8 years. He's also in debt to him, which means Whitaker's pocket and his wallet are the same thing." "Is there anything Whitaker can't reach?" "His conscience," Gant said. "But that's been quiet for long enough that it may have atrophied." Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to speak at the hearing." Gant looked at her. "Mrs. Collins, the proceeding will be—" "I know what it will be," she said. "I want to speak. Can I do that?" "You have the right," he said. "Whether it's strategically advisable." "Let me worry about strategy," she said. "You worry about the law." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Then I need you to understand what they're going to say about you." She held his gaze. "Tell me." He told her. He told her that Whitaker's argument would not be purely economic. That would be too transparent. It would be personal. It would question her suitability as a commercial operator, her stability, her standing. He had heard rumors. Gant said carefully that Whitaker intended to imply that a widowed woman operating an establishment that served primarily men was running something that might be— He paused, choosing the word irregular. The silence in Gant's office after he said that was the specific silence of something ugly being named. Maggie sat with it. She felt the heat of it in her face, not embarrassment because she had nothing to be embarrassed about, but the hot, clean anger of a woman who has done everything right and is about to be targeted with the implication that she hasn't. "He's going to call me a disreputable woman," she said. Gant did not look away. "He's going to imply it and let the implication do the work." "Yes." She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. "He's desperate," she said. "Yes," Gant said. "He is." "Good." She stood up. "Desperate men make mistakes. I'll be ready for it." She walked back to the kitchen. She picked up her grandmother's iron pot and moved it from the back burner to the front, a habit she had when she needed to think of rearranging her kitchen into the configuration that felt most like readiness. Then she sat at her corner table with a blank piece of paper and a pencil and wrote for 3 hours everything she intended to say at that hearing. Samuel read it that evening. He read it slowly, with the particular attention of someone who understands that what they're reading matters. When he finished, he set the pages down and looked at her. "Maggie," he said. "Is it too much?" she said. "No." He shook his head. "It's exactly enough. That's what makes it—" He stopped. "What?" "It's going to work," he said. "And when it does, Whitaker's going to know he picked the wrong fight." "He already picked the wrong fight," Maggie said. "He just doesn't know it yet." A week before the hearing, the second major twist arrived. Not from Whitaker. From a direction so entirely unexpected that even Maggie, who had spent months mapping every possible angle of this conflict, had not seen it coming. A letter arrived at the cattle station addressed to her. It was postmarked Helena, and the return address was a law firm she didn't recognize. She opened it in the kitchen with her morning coffee, read it once, set it down, picked it up, and read it again. Then she sat very still for a long time. The letter was from an attorney representing the estate of one Robert Perkins. The name meant nothing to her until the third paragraph, where it was clarified that Robert Perkins was the cook who had originally occupied the kitchen behind the Briggs cattle station and had left Red Willow 2 years before her arrival. Perkins had died in November in Helena, and in his will, with no living relatives and no other significant assets, he had left the kitchen. Not the land, not the building, both of those belonged to Briggs, but the equipment, the stove, the original cookware, the 2 iron skillets, the copper pot, the work table with the scarred surface that Maggie had scrubbed back to pale and clean on her first day. Left it all to the woman who was cooking in his kitchen. I hadn't known her name. The will simply said, "To whoever is cooking in my kitchen now, because if someone is cooking there again, they deserve it." Maggie sat with that letter in her kitchen for a long time. She thought about a man she had never met, who had cooked in this same space, who had left for reasons she would never know, who had spent his last years in Helena, and had apparently thought at some point before he died about the kitchen he had left behind and the person who might come after him. She thought about the iron pot she had carried from Kansas, the recipes on worn paper, the women who had come before her grandmother. Mother, the woman in the Abilene boarding house, who had given her the sourdough starter, the Mexican woman who had taught her pozole. The long chain of it. The way things passed from hand to hand across time, not because anyone planned it that way, but because some things were too important to disappear. She folded the letter and put it in the wooden trunk that had come with her from Kansas. Then she went back to work. She did not tell anyone about the letter. Not yet. There was something she needed to do first. She went to find Walter Briggs. She found him in the station office, which was where he usually was in mid-morning, and she knocked on the doorframe and waited to be invited in, and then sat across from him and said without any prelude, "Mr. Briggs, I would like to discuss the possibility of purchasing the kitchen building." Briggs looked at her over his desk. A long silence. "Purchasing," he said. "Yes, I understand the land is yours and would remain so. I'm talking about the structure, the kitchen, the storage room, the small coop out back. A lease to purchase arrangement if you're agreeable." Briggs leaned back in his chair and looked at her the way he had not looked at her in months, with the full attention of a man who is recalibrating. She was not the woman who had arrived with a wooden trunk and a rusted key anymore. He knew it. She knew he knew it. "You've got the county hearing coming up," he said. "I do." "And you're thinking about purchasing property." "I'm thinking about the future," she said. "The hearing is a problem I intend to resolve. After that, I want a permanent structure, not a borrowed one." Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What are you offering?" They negotiated for 45 minutes. When Maggie walked out of his office, she had a handwritten agreement in her pocket, preliminary subject to a formal document. Gant would draw up subject to the outcome of the hearing that gave her the right to purchase the kitchen building for $300 paid over 2 years. $300. It was an enormous sum. It was a reachable sum. It was the difference between a woman who cooked in a building that could be taken from her and a woman who cooked in her own. She stood outside Briggs's office in the January cold and felt the weight of what had just happened. The letter from a dead man she'd never met. The conversation with Briggs. The hearing coming in 6 days. and she thought about what her grandmother would have said. She could hear it clearly. "Girl, you keep moving forward. That's all you do. One foot, and then the other. The road takes care of itself." She put her hands in her coat pockets. She walked back to her kitchen. She had a hearing to prepare for. And she had 60 people coming for dinner. Both things were true at once. Both things had always been true at once. That was the thing. Nobody outside her kitchen had ever quite understood about Margaret Collins. She did not stop cooking when life got hard. She cooked harder. Because the meals were not separate from the fight. They were the fight. Every bowl of stew, every wedge of cornbread, every cup of coffee, set in front of a cold and tired man who needed something to hold on to. All of it was the argument she was making. The argument that she belonged here. The argument that what she had built was real and worth protecting. The argument that a woman who had been handed the ruins could build something so vital that the most powerful man in town would spend 6 months and considerable money trying to tear it down and still be losing. She lit the stove. She started the stock. Outside the kitchen window, Red Willow went about its January business, not knowing that 6 days from now everything in this town was going to change. And inside the kitchen, Maggie Collins cooked. The morning of February 8th arrived with the kind of cold that made Montana feel like a personal argument between a man and the elements. The kind of cold that got into your coat before you even stepped outside and sat in your chest like a stone. Maggie was up at 4. She had not slept well. Not because she was afraid she had made her peace with fear 2 nights ago, had sat with it at the corner table and looked at it directly. The way you look at something you intend to walk through rather than around. She hadn't slept well because her mind kept running the hearing. The way a river runs a channel, it has worn smooth the same path over and over, testing for weaknesses, looking for the place where the argument might give way. She made coffee. She sat at the corner table with the speech she had written and read it one last time. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and went to start breakfast. She was not going to the hearing hungry. By 5 o'clock 6 men had already come through the kitchen door earlier than usual, drawn not by habit, but by some collective instinct that today was a day to show up. Billy came first, then Fletcher, then 2 of the rocking tea hands. Hatch himself arrived at 5:30, which meant he had ridden in the dark, which meant he had left his ranch before anyone who did not care would bother. Nobody said much. They ate. They drank their coffee. They sat a little longer than they usually did. That was enough. At 7, Samuel came. He had dressed like a man who understood that some occasions required a different level of himself. The good coat, the boots that had been cleaned, the hat that he wore only when something mattered. He sat at her table and looked at her with the specific quiet steadiness that she had come to understand was his version of, "I am here, and I am not going anywhere." "How are you?" he said. "Ready," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I'll be in that room." "I know. If Whitaker says anything." "Samuel." She put her hand on the table between them, not quite touching his. "Let me handle it. That's what this is. Me handling it." He looked at her hand, then at her face. Then he nodded once with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision that costs him something. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The county commissioner's meeting room was in the back of the post office building, which was the largest public interior in Red Willow that didn't belong to a church or a saloon. By 8 o'clock, when Maggie arrived with Samuel and Gant, the room was already more than half full. She had not expected that. She had known people would come, Hatch and his men, Martha Aldrich, a few of the regular faces. What she had not expected was the density of it, the way the room had filled with people she had fed over the past 7 months. People she knew by order and by name, and by the particular way each of them took their coffee people who had ridden in from outfits 20 miles away on a February morning, because they had decided that what happened today was something they wanted to be present for. She walked to the front of the room. She did not look at Charles Whitaker, who was already seated at the respondents' table, with 2 men she did not recognize. Lawyers, she assumed from Helena or Billings, the kind of lawyers whose suits communicated the specific message that their client had money to spend on this. She sat down at the petitioner's table with Gant on her right and her folded speech in her coat pocket, and the iron pot of her grandmother's memory sitting somewhere in her chest, solid and warm, and older than any of this. Commissioner Ferris called the hearing to order at 8:15. How was a thin, dry man with a face that had arranged itself over the years into an expression of permanent slight disapproval, the kind of face that had forgotten how to change. He read the procedural preamble in the tone of a man who found the formalities as tedious as his breakfast, and Maggie watched him and thought about what Gant had told her in Whitaker's pocket for 8 years. Debt. Obligation. The specific moral exhaustion of a man who owes more than he can repay and has started counting what he owes as part of himself. She thought he is not a villain. He is a tired man who made a series of small bad choices and now cannot find the door back to the person he used to be. That thought steadied her more than anger would have. Whitaker's lead attorney, a florid, confident man named Durrell, who had the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms that arranged themselves around him, opened with precisely the argument Gant had predicted. The Collins operation, he said, occupied a commercial position that had not been reviewed for township compliance. The county's commercial premises ordinance existed to ensure that all food service establishments operated under the same regulatory standard. He used the phrase unfair competitive advantage twice, and both times Maggie felt the room shift slightly, the way a room shifts when it is trying to decide whether something is reasonable or convenient. Then Durrell set down his notes and looked at the commissioners with the expression of a man about to deliver the real point. There is also, he said, the matter of the establishment's particular character. And there it was. She had known it was coming. Gant had told her. She had prepared for it. But knowing a blow is coming and feeling it land are different things, and what she felt when Durrell began to imply carefully, never directly with the polished skill of a man who has done this before, that an unmarried woman running a kitchen that served primarily men, operating out of a residential structure on a cattle station, might be engaged in something that went beyond the service of food. What she felt was a rage so clean and so specific that it almost lifted her out of her chair. She held herself still. She let him finish. There was a sound in the room when he stopped speaking, not words, a sound. The particular collective sound of 60 people deciding something simultaneously and without consultation. Ferris looked at her. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "you may respond." She stood up. She did not take out the speech. She had practiced it 50 times. She knew it in her bones. And she knew standing up in that room with the sound of 60 people behind her and the rage in her chest burning down to something cleaner and more useful that she didn't need the paper. She looked at the commissioners, not at Ferris. At all 5 of them. Directly one after another with the eye contact of a woman who has been looked at her entire life by people who saw everything but her and has long since decided that she will look back. "I came to Red Willow 7 months ago," she said. "I came with a wooden trunk, my grandmother's iron pot, and $62, which was every cent I had in the world, after burying my husband and settling his debts. Mr. Briggs gave me the use of an abandoned kitchen that had been deteriorating for 2 years because no one else wanted it. The roof leaked in 3 places. The stove door was hanging off its hinge. The tables were rotted through." She paused. "I repaired it myself. I cleaned it myself. I planted a herb garden outside the door. I opened for service and I fed whoever came." She let that land. "Over the past 7 months," she continued, "I have served more than 4,000 meals. I have employed 3 local women part-time in the peak season. I have purchasing contracts with 2 local ranches and a local farmer, all of whom have told me that the contracts have materially improved their income. I pay my bills within 7 days. I have never once in 7 months of operation had a complaint about the quality of my food, the cleanliness of my kitchen, or the conduct of my establishment." Another pause. "The county's commercial premises ordinance was enacted in October. My establishment has been operating since August. The ordinance was written 3 months after my kitchen became successful enough to be noticed. I will let the commissioners draw their own conclusions about the relationship between those 2 facts." She heard something behind her. Not words. Something between a murmur and a laugh quickly suppressed. "As for the character of my establishment..." Her voice did not change. It did not rise. It did not take on the tremor of someone who is fighting not to cry, because she was not fighting not to cry. She was entirely, completely calm. I am a widow. I am a cook. I run a kitchen where men come to eat meals that are made with skill and served with dignity. Any suggestion beyond that is the resort of a man who has run out of legitimate arguments and is hoping that slander will accomplish what evidence could not. The room went very still. Even Durrell was still. Ferris cleared his throat. Mrs. Collins. I'm not finished, she said. Ferris stopped. I would like to ask the commission to consider one more thing, Maggie said. The men who eat at my table ride from as far as 40 miles to do so. They come from outfits across this valley and the next. They are ranch hands and foremen and farmers and tradesmen, and they come because the food is good, and because they feel when they sit at my table that someone thought about them before they arrived. That is not a disreputable thing. That is the oldest thing there is. That is what a table means. She looked at the 5 commissioners. This commission has the power to grant or deny my license. Whatever you decide, I will tell you what will happen either way. If you grant it, I will continue to operate a kitchen that serves this community with everything I have. If you deny it. She paused. If you deny it, I will appeal. And I will continue to operate. And I will not stop until every legal avenue has been exhausted. Because I did not build what I have built in order to hand it to a man who was threatened by a woman with an iron pot and a better biscuit. The silence after she sat down was the loudest thing Maggie Collins had ever heard. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then the room behind her came apart. Not in chaos. In something that had more structure than chaos, but more feeling than order voices and the scrape of chairs, and someone in the back actually saying out loud, in the kind of voice that had forgotten to stay quiet. That's right. Ferris hammered his gavel 3 times. The commission retired to deliberate. Maggie sat at the petitioner's table, with her hands folded and her heart hammering and her face entirely composed, and Gant leaned over and said in a low voice, "That was the finest piece of speaking I have witnessed in 20 years of law." "Did it work?" she said. "We'll know in 30 minutes." She turned once to look at Samuel. Howe was sitting 4 rows back, and when she turned, he was already looking at her, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has just watched someone he cares about do something extraordinary and is trying to contain what that does to him. She turned back to face the front. She waited. What happened next, she did not expect. While the commission was in deliberation, Charles Whitaker stood up, not to speak to the room, not formally. He simply stood and in standing drew every eye, because a man like Whitaker standing unexpectedly in a public room was its own kind of announcement. He was looking at Maggie. She turned in her chair and looked back at him. His lawyers were both looking at him with the expression of men whose client was about to do something they had not advised. "Mrs. Collins," Whitaker said. The room was instantly absolutely quiet. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. Howe was quiet for a moment. His face, that trim, precise face she had watched from across the street on that first Tuesday in August, was doing something she had not seen it do before. It was working. As though the gears of it were turning against a resistance they weren't built to handle. "My attorney made an implication," he said, "regarding the character of your establishment." Another pause. That implication was not accurate, and it should not have been made. The silence deepened. Durrell looked like a man who had been handed a scorpion and was trying to decide whether to drop it. Maggie looked at Whitaker. She waited. "I have operated the Whitaker house for 12 years, he said. "I built it from nothing. I am not accustomed to competition." He said the word like it tasted strange. I have not handled this well." It was not an apology. It was too clipped, too structured, too still, carrying the posture of a man who was not accustomed to being wrong. But it was something. It was a man who had made a series of choices in the dark, and was standing briefly in the light and finding the view uncomfortable. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, "for saying so." She turned back to face the front. Behind her she heard Whitaker sit down. The commission returned in 22 minutes. Ferris was the last through the door, and she watched his face as he took his seat, because a man's face coming back from deliberation tells you something before his mouth does, if you know how to look. His face was carefully arranged to show nothing. But there was something around his eyes, something that looked, if she was reading it right, like the specific combination of relief and discomfort that arrives when a man has done the right thing for the first time in a while and isn't sure yet how it sits. He read the decision. The commercial license was granted. The fee would be set at the same rate as existing commercial establishments, a rate that turned out when it was stated aloud to be $12 per quarter, not $40, because $40 had been set for the Collins kitchen specifically, and the commission had found the targeting to be outside the scope of the ordinance's intent. $12 per quarter, $48 a year. She could pay that in 2 weeks. The room behind her did not erupt. It exhaled a collective, genuine, long-held breath, releasing all at once, and in the exhale, there were a few voices, and someone's hand came briefly onto her shoulder from the row behind and was withdrawn, and Martha Aldrich said something to the woman beside her that Maggie couldn't hear, but that sounded like it had finality to it. Samuel was beside her before she had fully stood. I didn't say anything. He just put his hand out, and she took it, and they stood in the emptying room while people moved around them, and neither of them felt the need to put words to what was happening. Gant shook her hand with both of his. Appeal wouldn't have been necessary, he said, but it was a better speech than any appeal. Hatch came up on her other side and said without sentiment, but with everything behind it, I'll have my boys there for dinner Friday, same as always. I'll have enough, she said, same as always. Hatch nodded and put his hat on and walked out. It was Ferris who surprised her. He came up when most of the room had cleared, his hat in his hand, his face doing that same complicated work it had been doing since he returned from deliberation. Mrs. Collins, he said. She looked at him. I owe you an apology, he said, for October, for allowing the ordinance to be calibrated the way it was. He stopped, started again. I've been operating for a long time under obligations. I should have found a way out of sooner. I'm not proud of it. But I want you to know that what happened today in that room, that was the commission's honest decision. No one's pocket was deep enough to change it. Maggie looked at him. She thought again about what she had thought before the hearing. Not a villain, just a tired man who had made a series of small bad choices and couldn't find the door back. Looking at Ferris now, she could see the door. He had found it, and he was standing in it, and he wasn't sure if it would hold him. Commissioner Ferris, she said, come by for lunch sometime. I'll feed you. He blinked. Everyone deserves a good meal, she said. That's what I do. He looked at her for another moment. Then something in his face rearranged itself, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way things rearrange when they have been under pressure for a long time, and the pressure finally releases. Yes, ma'am, he said. I believe I'll take you up on that. He put his hat on and walked out. Outside the post office, in the February cold, the cluster of men who had come to the hearing were standing around their horses, and their breath was making clouds, and they were doing the particular frontier thing of not quite celebrating, because celebration was not a comfortable register for most of them, but not quite leaving yet either. Standing together in the cold, because the day had meant something, and none of them were ready to ride away from it. Maggie came out and they looked at her. She looked back at them. Kitchen opens at 11, she said. I'm making posole. And that was that. They began to disperse by twos and threes back to their horses and their outfits and the ordinary business of their lives. And as they went, they passed the Whitaker house, which was open and quiet, and had been. Maggie suspected quiet for some time. She thought about that as she walked back to the cattle station with Samuel beside her. She thought about 12 years of monopoly and what it did to a business, the way being the only option made you stop having to be good. The way certainty of customers made you stop thinking about what those customers actually needed. She thought about Whitaker standing up in that room. She thought about Ferris and the door he had found. She thought about how much energy it took to hold a grudge in a hard land, and whether any of it was worth the cost. She was still thinking about it the next morning when she answered a knock at the kitchen door at 7:30 and found Charles Whitaker on the other side. He was alone. No lawyers, no representatives. Just a man in his coat with his hat in his hand, and the look of someone who has rehearsed something and is no longer certain the rehearsal was adequate. She looked at him. Mr. Whitaker, she said. Mrs. Collins. He paused. I wonder if I might speak with you. She stood back from the door. Come in. He came in. He stood just inside the door, looking at the kitchen, at the scrubbed surfaces, and the herbs on the windowsill, and the iron pot on the front burner, and the signs of a working kitchen that was also, without quite making a point of it, someone's home. You built this, he said. I did. He looked at his hat for a moment. I spent 6 months trying to take it from you. I know. I failed. You did. He looked up. Why did you build it here? You could have gone to any town in the territory. You had the skill. Why Red Willow? It was such an unexpected question that it caught her off guard for a fraction of a second. Then she understood what he was really asking. He was asking why she had walked into his territory, into the sphere of his certainty, and taken root. Because this was where the door was, she said. Mr. Briggs had a kitchen nobody wanted. That was the door I had. And you walked through it. I don't have much patience for closed doors, she said. Never have. Whitaker was quiet. Then, my wife died 4 years ago. My restaurant, I built it for her originally. She was the one who wanted to run a proper house. When she died, He stopped. I kept going because I didn't know what else to do. The kitchen was very quiet. Maggie looked at this man who had spent 6 months trying to destroy her, and saw for the first time the full shape of him. Not the adversary, not the powerful man, but the person underneath, the one who had built something for love, and then lost the love, and kept building out of habit and fear. I'm sorry about your wife, she said. He looked at her. Something in his face cracked just slightly at the edges. I came to say that I will not obstruct your business going forward, he said. No more supply interference, no more commission maneuvers. Whatever competitive disadvantage I face from your presence here, I will address through my own operation, by being better. He paused. If I still know how. Then figure out how, Maggie said. Red Willow's big enough for 2 kitchens. A town with 2 good places to eat is better than a town with 1, regardless of what either of us thought this winter. Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. You are, he said, a remarkably gracious person, given the circumstances. I'm a cook, she said. We don't have time to be otherwise. There are always people to feed. He put his hat on. At the door he paused. For what it's worth, he said. The posole. I smelled it from the street yesterday when your door was open. He paused. I don't know what's in it, but it smelled like something worth trying. Maggie looked at him. Come at noon on Friday, she said. I'll have a bowl ready. He left. She stood in her kitchen after the sound of his footsteps faded, and she pressed her hands flat on the counter and looked at the wall and let herself feel the full, strange, enormous weight of this morning. Whitaker at her door, not as an enemy, but as a man. Ferris and the door. He had found the license in her pocket and the $300 agreement for the building, and Samuel's hand in hers, in the emptying meeting room the day before. Everything that had been in motion for 7 months had arrived all at once at a place she had not been able to see from where she started. She had not known when she slammed her grandmother's iron pot on that broken stove last August, that this was where the road led. She had not known that the man who handed her the ruined kitchen as a joke would repair its roof. That the man who tried to cut off her supplies would end up standing in her kitchen door asking for posole. That a dead man she never met would leave her his cookware. That a county commissioner would find a door back to himself at a public hearing in February. That a cowboy who had expected nothing more than a cup of coffee would sit at her corner table every week and look at her the way you look at something you have decided to stay for. She had not known any of it. She had just kept cooking. Samuel came in at noon, which was not his usual time, and found her in the middle of the lunch preparation, with her sleeves rolled to her elbows and flour on her forearm, and the kitchen at full roar, and he sat at the corner table and watched her work for a few minutes. You heard about Whitaker, she said. Not a question. Word travels, he said. Billy told Fletcher, told the rocking tea hands, told me, all before 8 this morning. What are people saying? That you fed the man who spent 6 months trying to shut you down. He paused. Some people think you're the most forgiving woman in Montana. Some people think you're the smartest businesswoman in Montana. And what do you think? Samuel looked at her. I think, he said slowly, that you're both, and that you know exactly which one is doing the work at any given moment. She laughed. He watched her laugh. Then he said with the quiet certainty of a man who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is it. Maggie, I need to ask you something. She set down the ladle. She turned around. She looked at him, this man at her corner table, who had been the first one through her door, who had brought Christmas branches in a snowstorm, who had sat steady and unmoving through every month of difficulty like something planted. Ask, she said. I have been in Red Willow for 8 months, he said. I came because there was work. I've stayed because... He stopped, started again. I've stayed because of this kitchen, because of you. And I need to know if that... He paused again, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked slightly unsteady, slightly unmoored, as though he had been practicing this conversation for weeks, and had arrived at the moment and found that practice was not the same as the thing itself. I need to know if that is something you'd want. The kitchen was loud around them. The stove, the simmering stock, the sounds of a working lunch service about to begin. Maggie looked at Samuel Carter. She thought about Thomas, who had been a good man, and whom she had loved, and who was gone. She thought about Kansas and the road that had brought her here. She thought about the iron pot and the worn paper recipes and the sourdough starter and all the things that had been passed from hand to hand, because some things were too important to disappear. She thought about the corner table and the first 50 cents and Christmas in a snowstorm and a hand held in an emptying room. She said, Samuel, I've been cooking your supper every Thursday for 2 months. What do you think that means? He looked at her. Then he smiled, the full version, not the small surprised one, the full one she had seen exactly twice and had stored both times. I think it means yes, he said. Then you've been paying attention, she said. She picked up the ladle. She went back to the stove. But the warmth in the kitchen from that moment was a different warmth than the stove, and both of them knew it, and the afternoon ahead was full of people to feed and meals to make, and a town that was slowly and imperfectly, and with all the mess that real things carry, becoming something she belonged to. And she was ready for every last bit of it. Charles Whitaker came on Friday at noon. He came alone, the same way he had come to her kitchen door the morning after the hearing. No lawyers, no representatives, just a man in his coat who had decided to stop sending others ahead of him. He sat at the table nearest the door, which was not the corner table, because the corner table was Samuel's, and by that point everyone in Red Willow who ate at Maggie's kitchen understood that without being told. Maggie set the pozole in front of him without ceremony. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his spoon. She went back to the stove. She did not watch him eat. She never watched anyone eat. She had always believed that the meal needed to be between the person and the food, without the cook in the middle of it, and she practiced what she believed. But she heard him. She heard the spoon set down after the first bite. The specific involuntary pause that she had learned over 22 years to recognize. When she looked over, Whitaker was sitting at the table with his eyes on the bowl and an expression on his face that she had not seen there before. Open, unguarded. The face of a man who has been reminded without any warning of something he had forgotten, he missed. He did not say anything about the food when he was done. He left exact payment the asking price, nothing more, nothing less, and he put his hat on, and he said at the door, Friday next if you're willing. I'll have a bowl ready, Maggie said. He came the following Friday, and the one after that, and each time he sat at the table nearest the door and ate without speaking much, and each time he left exact payment. And each time Maggie treated him the same way she treated everyone who sat at her tables, which was to say as though his presence there was the most natural thing in the world. It was Martha Aldrich who noticed it first, because Martha noticed everything. Whitaker has eaten at your kitchen 4 Fridays in a row, she said one morning in late February when she came in for her standing Thursday coffee order. Do you know what people are saying? I imagine I can guess, Maggie said. They're saying he's gone soft. Martha set her cup down. They're also saying that whatever you put in that pozole is some kind of medicine. Maggie laughed. "It's hominy and dried chili and thyme," she said. "That's all." "Then maybe that's the medicine," Martha said. Time. It was not lost on Maggie that the town's story about Charles Whitaker was changing. Not quickly. Nothing in Red Willow changed quickly, because the frontier had its own pace, and that pace was set by seasons and necessity rather than sentiment. But by March, the hardest edge of what people said about him had begun to soften. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. But the particular shift that happens when a man's actions begin to contradict the story people have been telling about him, and the story has to make room for the new information. He had not interfered with her supply chain since February. He had not spoken to any commissioner about her operation. When 2 new outfits from the Eastern Valley began sending their men to her kitchen men who had previously eaten at the Whitaker house. By default, he did not respond with any of the tactics she had spent months bracing for. He responded by hiring a new cook, a woman from Billings named Grace, who had apparently spent 15 years in a hotel kitchen and who arrived in Red Willow with a repertoire that Maggie, tasting the Whitaker house's Tuesday special, through Billy's detailed and somewhat breathless report, had to admit sounded genuinely good. She told Samuel this on a Thursday evening. He raised his eyebrows. "You're not worried?" "No," she said. "A town with 2 good kitchens is better than a town with 1. I said that to Whitaker in February. I meant it." Samuel looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his specific expression for her, the one that combined admiration with something warmer and more specific and considerably less tidy. "You know, most people in your position would be worried," he said. "Most people in my position," Maggie said, "didn't start with a leaking roof and 3 tables and a stove door held on with salvaged iron." She picked up her coffee. "After that competition from a man who finally learned to cook properly doesn't keep me up at night." March moved into April. The ground thawed. The herb garden came back to life at the kitchen door. Not just the rosemary and thyme she had planted in her first week, but the additions she had made through the fall, the sage and the flat-leaf parsley, and the small stand of chives that had surprised her by surviving the Montana winter with apparent indifference to its difficulty. She stood at the kitchen door on the first genuinely warm morning of April and looked at the garden and thought about August the beginning. August, the August of the rusted key and Walter Briggs's mocking smile, and the distance between that morning and this one felt like something much longer than 8 months. It felt like a different life, which it was. The purchase agreement for the kitchen building was finalized in the first week of April. Gant brought the papers to the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, which she had not expected. She had assumed she would go to his office, and he set them on her counter and explained each clause with the thoroughness of a man who believes that people should understand what they're signing, not simply trust that it's right. She read every word. She asked 3 questions. Then she signed her name. Margaret Ann Collins. She had not written her full name in a long time. She had been Maggie since she was 6 years old, since her grandmother had looked at the child's handwriting on the paper and said, "All those letters are a lot for a little person, aren't they? We'll call you Maggie." She had been Maggie through everything, through Thomas and the Kansas homestead, and the boarding house in Abilene, and the road west, and the ruined kitchen, and the supply fights, and the county hearing, and all of it. But she signed Margaret Ann Collins on the purchase agreement for her kitchen building, because this was the kind of thing her full name was for. Gant shook her hand. Then he said, "One more thing," and reached into his case and produced a second document. She looked at it. It was the will, Robert Perkins's will. The original, not the letter she had received in January, but the formal legal instrument transferred now to her records as the titled recipient of the kitchen equipment. "It's yours formally now," Gant said. "The estate is settled." She held the document for a moment. She thought about Robert Perkins cooking in this same kitchen, standing at this same stove years before she arrived. She thought about what a person leaves behind, not intentionally. Not in the grand sense, but in the small specific sense of the things that carry their fingerprints forward. The worn surface of the work table. The way the stove drew heat from the left side more than the right. The particular depth of the main cookware shelf built to accommodate a large pot. Built to accommodate her grandmother's iron pot, as it turned out. As though someone had measured it right. "Thank you, Gant," she said. He left. She stood in her kitchen alone for a moment, holding the will and the purchase agreement, and then she opened the wooden trunk that had come with her from Kansas and laid both documents inside, beside the folded recipes in her grandmother's hand and her mother's hand, and the letter from Perkins's estate, and the list of supply contributors with their repayment notes, and the first 50 cents Samuel Carter had ever left on her table, which she had kept without entirely deciding to the way you keep things that mean something before you've found the words for what they mean. She closed the trunk. She went to start the morning prep. The first Saturday in May brought the largest crowd her kitchen had ever seen. It was not planned. Or rather, it was planned the way things on the frontier were planned, which was to say, someone had an idea and mentioned it to someone else, and that someone else mentioned it to a third person, and by the time it arrived, it had grown past anything the original idea had contained. The idea had been Samuel's. He had come to her in late April with the specific expression of a man who has been thinking about something for a while and has decided to stop just thinking about it. "I want to do something," he said. "For the kitchen. For to market." "Mark what?" she said. "You signed the purchase papers," he said. "You own the building. You've been here 9 months. You survived Whitaker and Pruitt and the hearing and a Montana winter, and you never shut down for a single day." He paused. "I think that deserves marking." She looked at him. "What did you have in mind?" "A dinner," he said. "A real one. Not the service, a dinner. Saturday evening. Everyone who's been part of this." He paused again. "If you'd let me organize it." She was quiet for a moment. "Who would cook?" she said. He looked at her. "You would," he said. "Obviously." She laughed. "Samuel, you want to throw me a party where I do all the cooking?" "Yes," he said without apology. "Because you cook the way other people love, like it's the most natural expression of who you are. And I want everyone who's been sitting at your tables for 9 months to see that, together, all at once." She looked at him for a long time. "All right," she said, "but I get to decide the menu." "I wouldn't dare suggest otherwise," he said. He organized it with the quiet, methodical competence she had come to understand was his characteristic mode, not loud, not showy, but thorough. The kind of organizing that makes things happen without requiring anyone to notice the organizing. He sent word to the outfits. He spoke to Hatch and to Reese and to Fletcher and to Billy and to every regular face that had passed through the kitchen door since August. He talked to Martha Aldrich, who immediately took charge of the table arrangements with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for a project that deserved her full attention. He came to Maggie 3 days before the dinner with one additional question. "Whitaker," he said. She knew what he was asking. She thought about it for exactly as long as it needed. "Invite him," she said. Samuel nodded. No argument, no qualification. Just the nod of a man who had expected exactly that answer and respected it. Saturday came warm and clear. The particular clarity of a May evening in Montana, when the sky goes that specific shade of blue that doesn't exist anywhere else, and the air smells like the earth waking up from a long, cold sleep. Maggie had been cooking since 4 in the morning. Not because she had to, she had planned the menu with the kind of precision that makes 4 in the morning, not a burden, but a pleasure. But because she wanted to. Because specifically this meal, deserved the full investment of everything she had. She made the posole. She made the sourdough, the long rise kind that had been proving since Thursday. She made the spiced apple cake that had started the word of mouth in October, the one that had made men mention it to other men around fires. She made the slow braised beef that Perkins's copper pot was, she had come to believe, specifically designed to produce. She made biscuits and cornbread and a chicken fricassee from a recipe in her mother's hand that she had not made since Thomas was alive because it was too much food for one person. She made it now because there would be enough people to eat it. By 6 in the evening, there were 47 people at the tables in and around Maggie's kitchen. Martha had arranged additional tables outside, borrowed from the church, carried over by 6 cowboys who had apparently competed for the task of being useful. And the May evening was warm enough to eat outdoors, and the kitchen door was open, so the warmth and the smell moved between inside and outside without any clear boundary. Maggie moved between the stove and the tables, and the people with the ease of a woman entirely in her element. She greeted people. She refilled coffee. She checked the braised beef with the practiced attention of someone who knew to the minute when it was right. She was working, which meant she was in the deepest sense at rest. Hatch was there. Reese was there. Fletcher and Billy and the rocking T-men and the Harker's hands, and two of the foremen from the Eastern Valley outfits she had not met until March. Gant was there, and the glass merchant whose family had eaten Sunday lunches for 2 months in exchange for 2 windows. Decker the carpenter was there, who had eaten 3 pieces of cornbread on the day he put on her roof, and had been a steady Friday presence ever since. Ferris was there. He came in quietly earlier than most, and sat at the end of one of the outdoor tables, and ate his meal with the contained, deliberate manner of a man who is aware that his presence here requires a certain care, who understands that the invitation extended to him was an act of generosity he has not yet fully earned and intends to honor by not overstepping it. When Maggie passed his table with the coffee pot, he looked up and said, "Mrs. Collins, this is the finest meal I have eaten in 15 years. Come back Tuesday," she said. "I'm making pasole again." Something moved across his face. "I'll be there," he said. Whitaker arrived at 7, which was late, which she suspected was intentional. A man who understood that he was a particular kind of guest at this particular gathering. A man who had enough self-awareness to arrive after the room was established, rather than before it, so that his presence could be absorbed, rather than confronted. He stood at the edge of the outdoor tables, and looked at everything. The people, the tables, the open kitchen door, the warmth and noise of it. And Maggie watched him from inside the kitchen, and saw something happen in his face that she had been waiting without exactly knowing she was waiting to see. He saw what she had built, not the commercial operation. Not the competitor's establishment. Not the entity that had cost him customers and money and sleep. He saw what was actually here, 47 people eating and talking and passing bread and laughing and being for an evening in the same place together in a way that the frontier did not usually provide. He saw a table in the old sense, the sense that predated commerce, predated strategy, predated every fight they had spent 6 months having. I saw what she had meant when she said it at the hearing. A place where someone thought about you before you arrived. Samuel appeared at her elbow in the kitchen doorway. "He's going to stand there all night if someone doesn't invite him to sit," he said quietly. Maggie handed Samuel the coffee pot. She walked out to where Whitaker was standing. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "come sit down." He looked at her. The complicated thing moved across his face again. "I'm not sure I've earned a seat at this table," he said. "Nobody earns a seat at my table," Maggie said. "They just need to be hungry. Are you hungry?" A long pause. "Yes," he said. "I believe I am." "Then sit down," she said. "I'll get you a plate." He sat. She brought him a plate with the braised beef and the sourdough and the roasted vegetables and a cup of coffee, and she set it in front of him and went back to the kitchen. Samuel was waiting. "How is he?" Samuel said. "Hungry," Maggie said. "Like everyone else." Samuel looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Maggie." "Yes. I've been thinking about something." She looked at him. The kitchen was loud around them, 47 people talking and eating the sounds of a full evening. She looked at Samuel Carter standing in her kitchen with the coffee pot in his hand and his good coat on, and something in his face that she recognized with her whole body before her mind had finished processing it. "I've been in Red Willow for 9 months, he said. "I've been in this kitchen for 9 months, and I've been thinking about—" He stopped, set the coffee pot down, started again. "I'm not a man who has stayed anywhere. You know that. You know it better than anyone." He paused. "But I'd like to stay here, if you'd have me." Another pause. "Not as a customer." She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen around them continued to be loud and full and alive, and Maggie Collins stood in the middle of it. This kitchen she had dragged back from ruin. This kitchen, she now owned this kitchen that had grown from a broken stove and a grandmother's iron pot into the warmest place in Red Willow. And she looked at Samuel Carter and felt the full, clear, uncomplicated weight of yes. "Samuel," she said, "you have been at my corner table every week for 9 months. You brought me a Christmas branch in a snowstorm. You told 2 men the right story at the right moment and started a chain of word that changed everything. You held my hand in an emptying room. She paused. Do you think I don't know what that means? He looked at her. I was hoping, he said. You can stop hoping, she said, and start staying. Something in him settled. Like a man who has been riding a long time and has finally, in the most particular and certain way, arrived somewhere. He picked up the coffee pot. I'll go refill these, he said. She laughed. And the evening continued. But something had shifted inside it, something quiet and enormous, the way the most important things shift without ceremony in the middle of ordinary life. It was Billy who stood up later in the evening with the unself-conscious courage of a 16-year-old who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by sincerity. He stood at his place at the outdoor table with his cup raised. Not whiskey, just coffee, because Billy was 16 and Maggie had views on the matter. And he said in the loud, slightly unsteady voice of someone who has decided to say something before he loses his nerve. I want to say something about Mrs. Collins. The tables went quiet. Billy went slightly red. He kept going. I was the first one through the door in the mornings, he said, back when she opened at 5 so we could eat before the range. I didn't know what I was walking into. I just saw a light on and smelled breakfast. He paused. I've eaten at this table almost every day for 9 months. And I want to say that it ain't just the food. He looked at Maggie. I've been far from home since I was 15. And this kitchen is the first place I've been that felt like somewhere I was supposed to be. He stopped, swallowed. So, thank you, ma'am. Thank. He sat down. The tables erupted not in polished applause, but in the frontier version, the boots on wood, and the called-out agreements, and the coffee cups raised, and someone in the back said, "Hear, hear." And someone else said, "Boy took the words right out of my mouth." And Fletcher said from his place at the corner of the outdoor table, "Speak for yourself, I'm here for the apple cake," which made the whole thing tip into laughter and ease. Maggie stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of them. She did not trust herself to speak. She did not need to. The evening wound down slowly. The way evenings do when people are reluctant to leave gradually by ones and twos, with the specific reluctance of people who are not quite ready to return to ordinary life from somewhere that has felt for a few hours exceptional. Hatch was one of the last to go, and he stopped at the kitchen door and said in the manner of a man who has been composing his parting words for several minutes, "Whatever you need, you know where to find me." "I know," Maggie said. "Thank you, Hatch." He nodded, put his hat on, left. Whitaker left quietly while the room was still full enough that his departure was not a ceremony. He stopped at the kitchen doorway, the same doorway where he had stood in February with his hat in his hand, and he said, "Mrs. Collins, thank you for the invitation." "Thank you for coming," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "My wife," he said. "Her name was Eleanor. She would have liked to eat here." He paused. "She would have liked you." He put his hat on and walked into the May night. Maggie stood in the doorway for a moment after he was gone. Then Martha appeared at her elbow with a dishcloth and a look that said the sentiment portion of the evening was now concluded and there was clearing up to be done, and the two women began to move through the tables collecting cups and plates with the comfortable efficiency of people who have been in the same kind of work long enough to do it without needing to talk. Samuel stayed. Of course Samuel stayed. He stayed and helped clear and helped wash, and when everything was clean and the tables were stacked and the stove was banked and the kitchen was quiet. He sat at the corner table and she sat across from him, and they drank the last of the evening's coffee in the particular silence that belongs to the end of something large. 9 months, he said. 9 months, she agreed. You know what I remember about the first time I walked through that door? The smell, she said. You've told me. That, he said. And you. Turned around at the stove. You didn't startle. You just turned around and said, "Are you hungry?" like it was the most natural thing in the world. He paused. Like you'd been expecting me. She looked at him across the table. Maybe I had been, she said. He smiled. The full one. The one she had stored twice and now had lost count of because it had stopped being a rare occurrence and become something reliable. Something she expected and received and was still every time glad of. Maggie, he said. Yes. Can I ask you something I've been meaning to ask for a while? She looked at him steadily. "You can ask me anything, Samuel." He reached into his coat pocket. He set something on the table between them. It was small. A ring, simple, plain silver, the kind a working man bought with the money he had, rather than the money he wished he had, and the kind that a woman who had spent her life valuing substance over surface would recognize as more honest than anything fancier could have been. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I don't have a speech," he said. "You know I'm not a man with speeches, but I am a man who knows what matters to him, and you matter to me more than anything I have known in my life." He paused. "I would like to stay. Not as a customer like I said before, as your partner, in the kitchen and out of it and in everything, if you'll have me." The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, the May night was warm, and the Montana sky was doing its particular thing with stars, and the herbs were growing beside the kitchen door. And somewhere in the town, a dog was barking at something, and these were the sounds of a real place, a living place, a place that Maggie Collins had built from ruins with her own 2 hands and her grandmother's iron pot and 22 years of knowing how to make people feel like they belonged somewhere. She looked at the ring. She looked at Samuel Carter. She thought about the $62 and the rusted key and Walter Briggs's mocking smile and the 3 patches of Montana sky that had shone through the kitchen roof. She thought about Robert Perkins leaving his cookware to whoever was cooking in his kitchen. She thought about a dead man she never met who had trusted the future enough to believe that someone would come after him who deserved the tools. She thought about the chain of it, the long, unbroken chain. She picked up the ring. She put it on. "Yes, she said. "That's my answer, Samuel. It's yes. It has been yes for a very long time." He looked at her hand, then at her face. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. The way you hold something that finally belongs to you, carefully and completely, and without any intention of letting go. They sat like that in the quiet kitchen for a long time. The iron pot sat on the clean stove. The herbs grew beside the door. The purchase agreement and the will and the 50 cents and the worn paper recipes were all in the wooden trunk. The roof was solid. The windows were good. The tables built by local ranchers stood clean and ready in the warm dark. And Margaret Collins, the woman. Everyone in Red Willow had expected to fail the woman who had been handed the ruins as a joke. The woman who had built from broken walls and a leaking roof and a stove held together with salvaged iron. Something so meaningful that men rode 40 miles across the Montana plains just to sit down at her table. Margaret Collins was exactly where she had told herself she would be on the morning she made her promise to the 4 broken walls. She was still here. She was still here, and the kitchen was hers, and the man at her table was staying, and the town outside the door was better for what she had built in it. And every person who had ever doubted her had sat at her table and been fed anyway, because that was who she was. That was who she had always been. And that all of it, the fight and the ruins and the healing and the love and the table set for everyone, was more than enough. It was everything. It was the only story worth telling, and it was entirely, completely, permanently hers.